Welcome to part 2 of my 3-to-1 counterpoint response video. In this video, I'm going to go over basically direct fifths and octaves and also some parallel fifths and octaves. These are going to be in the same examples I used in my first video, but basically I rewatched my analysis for my 2-to-1 and 3-to-1 videos, and I realized that one thing I didn't really mention that much was I didn't mention all of the direct fifths or octaves. I didn't really mention that at all. And then I didn't mention all of the parallel fifths and octaves because I thought that this was an obvious thing, and the whole point of these videos was to show responses that had common mistakes in them. It was not to show an example of these responses. But in my next analysis videos, I'm going to show a response that has common errors in it, and then I'm going to walk through what those errors are and how to correct them, and then at the end of it show the same thing without the errors, and you'll learn how we fixed it and also how we can avoid it by preventing it and not just fixing it after finishing the response. So we're going to be looking at our upbeats, and we're going to be looking for perfect intervals, which are going to be forming our perfect consonances. And the reason of this is because we're going to see how these are approached. The upbeats are each change of the given melody, since in these cases it's always a blank to one relationship. So because of that, you always have your potential change of chord, a very emphasized moment, so we need to be careful how we're approaching this. However, when we have the other notes that aren't that a first initial beat, then we see that they can run through things like fifths and octaves because the bottom note would be traveling in oblique motion compared to it, which is fine to have one voice moving in oblique motion while the other voice maybe even leaps into a perfect interval. So that's why we're looking at the downbeats here on the strong beats, and more importantly, beat 1 of each measure. Okay, so we see a perfect fifth here, and we see how it's approached. The given melody is going up, and the counterpoint is also going up. The same thing, we have another fifth, but this time we see that the counterpoint is going down, and the given melody is also going down. So again, we have that direct motion, we have similar motion because it's going from a different interval to a fifth, and we don't want that at all. We do want contrary motion to our perfect intervals. And that's why it's also good to shoot for imperfect intervals on each of the first beats of your measure. Therefore, you won't have to worry about direct motion, and if you do choose perfect intervals on your first beats, just really be aware of how you're going to approach them. Okay, moving on, we see an octave. Same thing, direct motion going up to it. Okay, so the conclusion of this basically is that if you're just trying to pay attention to the shape of the melody, you can make a nice shape of a melody. But if you're trying to make that have good voice leading, well, you're going to have to avoid the things like going to your perfect intervals with direct motion. Next example, we do see an octave here on beat 1 of this measure, but we see that it is approached in contrary motion as the counterpoint goes up and the given melody goes down. Then we have a fifth, and this one is approached in direct motion. And that's it for this one. So these things are easy to fix, and one just critical thought is that if you're not working with a relationship of bass to tenor, either if you're going up or down, writing your counterpoint, then it's not going to matter if you're up here in the higher ranges, like even if you're tenor to alto, or here we have alto to soprano. If we used like a sixth interval here, even though we're implying a chord that isn't in a inverted state, because you can have notes in different orders above your root note that can still imply your root position or whatever inversion it is, as long as the bass is establishing what inversion it is. So as long as you have the notes that make up the chord, it's still going to be that chord, whatever inversion from the root. Therefore, we could no problem have a sixth here that's not a first inversion, in other words, a 4/6 chord, because this is up top in the position of where a chord would be. So just critical things to think about here if you're thinking about your chords and you're trying to say, oh, I wouldn't want to do a 6 because I wouldn't want that first inversion. So just things to think about. Okay, before moving on, just here's a quick fix. So I could have changed this into a third, then this could be a fifth, so it's just leaping up that third there, and then it's going up to a 6 and then going back down here where this creates a 6th here. So some you can just play with that measure, or some's just the few measures around it, and a lot of times you can end up making it work if you have a mistake somewhere. And I guess while we're here, we can just fix the octave too. So if instead I just go from a third to a fifth and then a sixth, you can see where it steps up and then it's going to be stepping back down. And now it's contrary motion with the octave. And you can see basically every step is in contrary motion with the given melody, so it's very nice. Okay, next we see a fifth and we see it's approached in contrary motion. Then we see an octave and this is also approached in contrary motion. And then we see a fifth and that is also approached in contrary motion. And furthermore, there's an octave in there and that's going in contrary motion to the fifth. Okay, so that one checks off. Next example, we see a fifth and it is approached in contrary motion. Then we see an octave that is approached in direct motion. Here's a simple fix to that, to where we have contrary motion now. It's interesting where the notes are alternating right here. It could seem slightly motivic, but I think it's interesting and maybe not because it's in a waltz. So because of that, you have your C's on beat 1 and 3 here. You have your D on beat 2, and then you have the opposite situation here. And then it goes through D and C again, but you have that gap in the middle. So I think it's using a lot of similar notes, but I don't actually think it would seem motivic. I think it would actually seem interesting and using the same notes though. Then we see an octave and it is approached in contrary motion. Then we see a fifth and it is approached in contrary motion actually by an octave. So that's fine. Of course, you wouldn't want a compound octave going to a closed octave, or same thing with a fifth, or like the other way, having a closed octave to a compound octave. These are still consecutive perfect intervals, and they're the same perfect intervals, so you don't want that. So that's why it's fine here, because we have an octave going to a fifth, so it's two different perfect intervals in contrary motion. Next we have a fifth, and this is being approached in direct motion. So there's an easy fix for that using the upper neighboring tone. Of course, now we have two upper neighboring tones next to each other, but the point is there's a fix to it. Then we have a fifth, and this is also approached in direct motion, where again we have similar motion because it's a different interval going to the perfect interval, and that looks like that's it for the perfect intervals on beat 1. Okay, we can do something simple like stepping the sixth down to a fifth and then going to a third, so then we can have contrary motion to this interval. Next we have a fifth, and here's a case to where we have an octave going to a compound fifth. So again, two different perfect intervals. That's totally fine. It's in contrary motion. And then here we have an octave that's being approached in direct motion. So what could we do to fix this to where this is being approached in contrary motion? To where we'd have our counterpoint somewhere above this D right here. Okay, so I could go from a 10 to an eighth to a sixth, and then we have contrary motion, and it's still stepwise from where we are recovering from that bottom leap. Of course, we have actual stepwise motion recovering it, and then we're broken up a third from the 10th to the 8th to the 6th. But I always like to think of thirds kind of as your best choice next to your second. They're definitely not the same thing or the same effect, but if you're trying to keep that nice stepwise or that nice melodic fluency, then your thirds are your next best choice from your seconds. Of course, the big difference is not just how it looks, but then how does it sound. With enough training, you can look at something and distinguish how it's going to sound. Okay, next we have a fifth here, and this one's kind of funny, because as you can see, the melody's creeping up, but this is approaching the fifth in direct motion, and this wouldn't be a very difficult time to have the melody approaching contrary motion. So let's fix this. Okay, so as you can fix that one, I had to adjust the measure before it as well, and actually what I did is now I turned this into a perfect interval, which is being approaching contrary motion. Again, we have some octaves and fifths here. May not be ideal, but again, this is showing you, okay, what are we going to be doing to fix this? We're going to be approaching this in contrary motion, and that's sometimes going to be causing us to affect the measures around us. That's the lesson of this. Okay, then moving on, as you see, we still are keeping a lot of that melodic fluency here, which is leading us up to a fifth here, again in contrary motion, and then we're stepping down and just going down a third to an octave, which is going in contrary motion to this fifth. and then from there we're going stepwise up to our cadence. Okay, so that's it for this video. I just really wanted to post a part 2 of both these videos because I actually ended up watching both of them, and I was thinking, oh gosh, I didn't really mention especially any of the direct fifths at all. I thought that's one of the main things in Counterpoint people thought about. I thought, let me talk about the main things that stick out in each of these is what I was going with. But in fact, I didn't talk about a lot of mistakes that were in it, and it was rather ironic because I literally went through these examples rather quick and made ones on purpose with mistakes so then I could go through and show common mistakes, but then I didn't end up talking about all of the common mistakes in every single one. So I learned my lesson, but I still want to keep the videos up there because they're already up, and now these are just going to be a part 2 to those videos. So just a completed version of everything. And it might be a good thing because the part 1 of the videos go over some different things that maybe you wouldn't be thinking about. A lot of times you'd think about only things like direct fifths and stuff like that, which is why I didn't have the video only that, because that's what you would expect. But here I am, I'm completing everything, so now we know what not to do, we know what we can do to fix it, and we know that if we want to prevent situations like this, we need to be careful of putting perfect intervals on our beat 1 of each measure. But then if we do put those perfect intervals, we need to pay attention to them and figure out how we're going to approach them in contrary motion. In these exercises, we're not going to be using oblique motion since our given melody is always going to be using oblique motion within that measure. So again, it's posing a slight challenge to the composer. Thank you very much. If you had any questions, leave in the comments. Make sure you subscribe to see more videos coming up. Right after this, I'm working on my 4-to-1 counterpoint responses, which in those, I'm actually going to go over things that are wrong with it first. And with those, I'm going to show one example, I'm going to show what's wrong with it, and then I'm going to go over how we can fix it, while along the way giving tips on how to prevent it and how to look out for things like this. Then there'll be one on suspensions. Okay, so be sure to check out those videos. Until next time, bye.